I still remember that night like it was yesterday. It was a Friday evening, the kind where the air is thick with the promise of adventure. My father had passed on his love for fishing to me, and with his passing, the boat had come into my possession, a Rodman 1250, a trusty vessel that had seen countless trips off the coast of Mississippi. It wasn't just a boat to me, it was a connection to my father. He had spent most of his life out there on the open sea, pulling in fish under the cold, indifferent stars. I loved that boat like it was part of my family. So, when my cousin Gabe called me up and suggested we take the boat out for an overnight fishing trip, I didn't hesitate. Gabe had always been a bit of a thrill seeker, and I was eager for a break from the routine. After all, it had been a while since I had set sail on the water. We packed the essentials, beer, snacks, a radio, and headed out just as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting everything in a golden hue. We made our way past the familiar stretch of coastline, the water calm, the night settling in. The boat bobbed gently, a sound that always put me at ease. We found our spot just beyond the cove, a good mile or two offshore. We dropped anchor and settled into the familiar rhythm of casting our lines, the world growing quieter as the evening wore on. The sounds of the radio played softly, and we joked about old times, the scent of salt in the air, the sea stretching out before us like an endless canvas. But as the sun disappeared completely, and the stars began to blink awake in the sky, something changed. Gabe, who had been reclining on the bench, suddenly sat up, his eyes scanning the horizon. I could feel the shift in the air, the kind that made the hairs on your neck stand up. "I hear something," Gabe said, his voice low, almost unsure. I squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing. The sea was still, the boat rocking gently as I pulled another beer from the cooler. "You're imagining things, Gabe," I said, half laughing. But Gabe wasn't laughing. He stood up and moved toward the railing, peering into the blackness beyond. "No, I swear. I hear a motor." I didn't say anything, but I listened. Sure enough, faintly, I could hear the hum of an engine, distant but growing closer. At first, I thought it was another boat, someone else out there on the water like us. But it was strange, too quiet, like the boat was moving in slow circles around us. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside, hoping to spot the other vessel. The water was still, eerily so. The engine sound faded for a moment, only to come back even louder. I turned the flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the water. Nothing. The ocean stretched dark and empty, the only light coming from our boat, casting a long, faint reflection on the water. Gabe was still staring into the distance, his hand gripping the side of the boat. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered. I agreed. Something about the way that engine had circled us felt deliberate. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. We were out here in the middle of the sea, after all. It was late, it was dark, and the world had a way of playing tricks on you when you were alone like this. I turned to Gabe. "Let's just move. If they're just passing by, they'll be gone in no time." We started the engine and began to drift farther out into the open water, trying to put some distance between us and the strange sound. The engine growled to life, cutting through the silence. But as we drifted, the sound of the motor followed us. Slowly, almost purposefully. At first, it was faint, then louder, as though someone was trailing us. I swore under my breath. Gabe was looking over his shoulder, his eyes wide with a growing sense of unease. We tried to outrun it, pushing the boat faster, but it was no use. The sound grew louder again, circling around us like a predator closing in. "Do you think they're coming after us?" Gabe asked, his voice tight with fear. I didn't know. But the hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and my instincts were telling me this wasn't just a coincidence. We had been out on the water many times before, but never like this. There was something wrong, something off about the whole situation. I stopped the boat, hoping that if we just waited, the other boat would move on. Gabe and I sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of the engine, which was still circling us. Then it stopped. Completely. We didn't move, barely breathed, as the silence settled in. And then, without warning, The sound of the engine started again, but this time, it was much closer. I flicked on the cabin light and glanced outside. In the dim glow, I saw it. Another boat. A small, dark shape cutting through the water, its engine almost silent now, as though trying to hide its presence. "Turn off the lights," Gabe hissed. "They'll see us." I killed the cabin light, plunging us back into darkness, the only light now the faint moon above us and the distant stars. I turned the boat around, trying to get away, but the other boat wasn't giving up. It was close now, just a few yards away, and I could hear the low murmur of voices. "Who the hell are they?" Gabe whispered, panic rising in his voice. I didn't know. But I had a sinking feeling in my gut. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. We started the engine again, full throttle, cutting through the water with all the speed we could muster. The other boat followed. For what felt like an eternity, we raced through the dark waters, our boat slicing through the waves, the sound of their engine trailing behind us. But every time I thought we had shaken them off, the sound would return, closer than before. I had no idea what they wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I pushed the boat harder, desperate to get back to shore. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to make out the other boat, but the darkness swallowed everything behind us. And then, just as I thought we were finally clear, I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the roof of the cabin. I froze. I didn't even have to say anything. Gabe's eyes were wide, and we both stood, looking at each other for a split second before making our move. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it outside, and I saw them. 2 men. One was standing on our deck, his hands gripping the railing as he stared at us. The other was on the boat behind us, watching us silently. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hey, we're out of gas," the man on our boat called out, his voice smooth but shaky. "Can you help us? We're stranded." But I didn't believe him. Something about the way he spoke, too calm, too rehearsed, set off every alarm in my head. I stepped forward, keeping my distance. "You need help?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe you should go back to your boat." The man took a step closer, and I could see his face now, pale, gaunt, and oddly tense. He reached out as if to shake my hand, but I wasn't having any of it. Something told me this wasn't a simple case of a boat running out of fuel. Instead of shaking his hand, I shoved him hard, knocking him off balance. He tumbled into the dark water with a splash. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of him splashing and struggling in the water. The man on the other boat started yelling, but I didn't wait. I fired up the engine and twisted the throttle, trying to outrun whatever was happening. We didn't stop until we were far enough out to see where I felt safer. It was only then that I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We slept on the boat that night, our nerves still rattled, not daring to go back to the shore until the first light of dawn. When we finally made it back to the harbor the next morning, the sun was rising over the water, casting everything in a warm, golden light. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that boat, or worse, those men, still following us. But there was nothing. Just the empty, calm sea. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there with us that night. Something that followed us, watched us, and might have had other intentions. The sea is vast and unforgiving, and at night, it hides things we're not meant to understand. It started out as an amazing adventure. My friends and I had been planning this cruise for months. We were excited for a relaxing getaway in Norway, away from the stresses of everyday life. The ship was huge, elegant, just the kind of vacation we all needed. I had always dreamed of traveling to the northern reaches of the world, to see the fjords, the glaciers, and to experience something different from the hustle and bustle of American life. The first 2 days were perfect. We went sightseeing, enjoyed delicious seafood, and had a great time bonding. But it was on the 3rd day that everything started to go wrong. It started with the sushi. Now, I love sushi. I've been eating it for years, but on this trip, I found myself eating it at every meal. The ship had an all-you-can-eat sushi bar, and I couldn't resist. At first, it was amazing, fresh, perfectly rolled pieces of tuna, salmon, and shrimp. But by the third day, something wasn't right. My stomach felt off, I started getting dizzy, and I couldn't shake the sensation of nausea. I thought it was just the motion of the boat, the rocking of the waves, but as the day went on, it got worse. By dinner, I was feeling miserable. I sat with my friends, trying to keep my composure. They kept asking if I was okay, but I didn't want to ruin their fun. Finally, after a particularly difficult meal, I couldn't take it anymore. I excused myself, telling them I needed to go back to my room to rest. I remember the look of concern on their faces, but I brushed it off. I just needed to sleep it off. The walk to my cabin wasn't far, but the ship felt enormous. The corridors all seemed to blend into one another, and I found myself momentarily lost a few times, my head spinning from the dizziness. But eventually, I came across a member of the cleaning staff, a woman who looked like she had just come out of one of the service halls. She looked at me and smiled politely, as if to say she knew I was heading the wrong way. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice soft and almost musical. "I think I'm just a little disoriented," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Can you point me to the main corridor? I'm looking for my room." She nodded and gestured for me to go straight ahead, then take a left. I thanked her and continued down the hall, but as I walked, something felt off. The floor beneath me felt different, like it wasn't the same as the rest of the ship. The tiles underfoot were rough, the air was colder, and there was something unsettling about the narrowness of the corridor. It didn't look like the passenger areas at all. The walls were dull, faded, with old, yellowing paint. The lighting was dim, and the whole area had a sense of neglect. At first, I thought I had taken a wrong turn, but then I saw the sign on the wall, crew only. My heart skipped a beat, but I was already so disoriented by the dizziness that I didn't think twice. I decided to keep going. Maybe I had walked too far, but I couldn't turn back. I was determined to find my room, to get some rest, and to make this nausea go away. The hall curved slightly to the left, and that's when I saw him. At the end of the corridor, standing against the wall, was a man. At first, I thought he was just another crew member, maybe someone on break. But there was something strange about him. He was facing the wall, his back to me, and his posture was stiff, like he was frozen in place. "Excuse me," I called out, but my voice barely echoed in the empty hall. The man didn't move. I called out again, louder this time, but still no response. That's when a chill ran down my spine, and I realized something was terribly wrong. The man didn't even breathe. I took a step closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I approached, the dim lights above flickered. The closer I got, the more I felt the air grow thick, as if I was walking through some unseen barrier. And then I saw it, the man's face. Or rather, the lack of it. His face was a void, an empty, dark space where his features should have been. It was as though his skin and eyes had been sucked away by some dark force. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and then I turned around and ran. My legs were shaking, and I could barely feel my body as I stumbled backward down the corridor. I couldn't look back. I knew that if I did, I would see him following me, his empty face, his cold eyes, whatever was left of him. I turned a corner, and the hall changed. The walls were different, now covered in smooth, gray metal. The dim light turned to flickering neon. And then the noise started, a soft humming sound. It was low at first, like a distant machine running, but it grew louder and louder, vibrating through my chest. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my throat felt dry. My head was spinning, and I could barely keep my balance as I staggered forward, trying to find a way back to the main deck. And then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. At the end of the corridor, just before the next bend, there was a figure standing in the darkness. This time, I didn't need to approach it to know something was wrong. This time, I knew it was real, whatever it was. The figure wasn't a crew member. It wasn't a person at all. It was something else. It was a shadow, a shape that didn't belong in the world of living, breathing beings. I could see it clearly now, even though the lights above me continued to flicker. It had no form, no texture. It was just a mass of darkness, an absence that seemed to devour the light around it. And as I stood there, frozen, unable to move, I felt a sense of dread that I had never experienced before in my life. Then the shadow moved. It didn't walk or shuffle. It simply floated, gliding toward me with a terrifying stillness, like it was weightless. I couldn't look away. I couldn't scream. My body was paralyzed, my heart pounding in my chest. And just when it was almost upon me, just when it was about to reach out for me, I woke up. I was in my bed. I could feel the cool sheets beneath me, and the soft hum of the ship's engine in the background. But there was something wrong. The room was too quiet. Too still. And that's when it happened. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, unable to even lift my head. I could only move my eyes. I felt like I was sinking into the mattress, like I was being swallowed by the very bed itself. My heart raced in my chest as I realized I was experiencing sleep paralysis, something I had read about but never thought would happen to me. And then I saw it. In the corner of my room. The same figure. The same shadow. It was standing there, just like in the hallway, its face a deep, impenetrable black void. I could feel its presence, an overwhelming, suffocating weight, pressing down on me. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. It began to drift closer, floating above the floor, hovering over my bed like a nightmare come to life. When it reached my bedside, it opened its mouth. At first, it was just a crack, a small hole in the blackness of its face, but then it widened impossibly, until its mouth was 2-3 times the size of a human's. It leaned in close, and a horrible, guttural scream tore from its throat. It was the most deafening sound I had ever heard, and it felt like it was tearing my very soul apart. I wanted to die. I wanted to escape. But I was frozen, trapped in my own body. The scream continued, each note scraping against my mind like nails on a chalkboard, until I finally woke up, this time for real. I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. The room was empty. The shadow was gone. But the fear lingered. I tried to tell my friend what happened, but she didn't believe me. She thought I was just having a bad reaction to the sushi, that it was all in my head. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that what happened on that ship was real. I still don't know if I was hallucinating from the food, or if I really encountered something otherworldly. But I can't shake the feeling that the shadow, the thing I saw both in the corridor and in my room, was waiting for me. It started out like any other journey. I had just moved from Georgia to Florida, and to be perfectly honest, I wasn't sure why I had made the decision to leave my family behind. But Florida was calling me. The idea of having a place by the coast, a home with the ocean practically at my doorstep, was intoxicating. What wasn't so intoxicating, though, was the logistics of getting all my things there. I didn't own a trailer or a truck, and with the cost of renting one skyrocketing, I figured I'd save myself the trouble and simply take a boat. It wasn't the most conventional method, but I wasn't in a rush. My plan was simple: load up my small sailboat, which I'd named the Tern, and make the journey down the coast. It was going to take me a few days, but that was part of the adventure, right? I packed enough food, water, and fuel for the trip, along with some spare clothing and a few odds and ends. I said my goodbyes to my family, who, to be honest, didn't exactly understand the choice I'd made. But it wasn't their journey. This was mine. The first day went smoothly. The weather was mild, the winds light, and the sea was calm. It felt like freedom. I sailed out of Georgia's waters and into the vast expanse of the Atlantic, heading south. When night fell, I anchored just off the coast of a small, uninhabited island. It was peaceful, just the sound of the waves lapping against the hull and the occasional creak of the boat. I made dinner, cracked open a beer, and sat on the deck, watching the stars. Eventually, I turned in for the night. I'd secured the cabin and tucked myself into the small berth, the sound of the water a steady lullaby. But it didn't take long for the calm to be interrupted. It was just after midnight when I felt it, the boat rocking gently, as though something had nudged it. I had anchored in relatively calm waters, so the motion didn't make much sense. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting the sails, or maybe a passing fish. But then I heard it. A distinct noise coming from above. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but I could swear it sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking across the deck. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't have been imagining it, right? I lay there, perfectly still, listening. The footsteps continued, faint at first, but then they seemed to grow louder. Step by step, they moved closer to the cabin. My mind raced. Who could be out there? The idea of someone boarding my boat in the middle of the night was enough to send a chill down my spine. Without thinking, I scrambled out of bed and pulled open the cabin door. The air outside was cool, and the deck was empty. Nothing seemed out of place. No sign of anyone. I stood there for a long moment, my eyes scanning the shadows, but the sea was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I climbed back into bed, trying to shake the unease that had settled into my chest. But sleep wouldn't come. It was like the rocking of the boat was amplifying my nerves. Then, without warning, I heard it again, the loud, unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the water. It wasn't a splash. It was like someone had jumped off the boat and into the ocean. My pulse raced as I shot out of bed, this time more urgent, more frantic. I flung the door open again and rushed out to the deck. The moonlight revealed nothing but empty waters. I searched frantically for any sign of someone, any clue that might explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. I froze, the unease now gnawing at me like a wild animal. Was it possible I'd imagined all of this? Was I losing my mind? I didn't know. But what I did know was that I didn't want to be out there anymore. I started the engine, the low hum of the motor giving me some comfort as I pulled away from the island. I tried to focus on the horizon, to push the strange noises out of my head. But as I sailed further into the night, the boat's hull suddenly thudded against something. At first, I thought I had hit another boat, but the water around me was clear, and the sound didn't seem to make sense. It was as if I had run into something solid and large, but I couldn't see a damn thing in the dark. I checked the hull, but there was no visible damage. I cursed under my breath. Whatever was happening, it was making my mind race. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a piece of debris, or maybe a large fish. But then the sound came again. A loud thump, followed by another. Closer now. I couldn't ignore it. I went to the stern, shining a flashlight across the water, but there was nothing. The sea was calm again. I spent the next few hours on edge, but the night passed with no further disturbances. I eventually anchored again, too exhausted to keep going. I tried to sleep, but after what had happened, rest was impossible. My mind wouldn't stop running through the events of the night, each noise becoming more terrifying the more I thought about it. I finally dozed off for what must have been about half an hour. And then, it came again. This time, it was unmistakable. The sound of breathing. Not mine. No. This was someone else's breath, deep and ragged, coming from the cabin. My heart lurched in my chest. Who the hell was on my boat? I bolted upright and crept toward the cabin, every step feeling like it was too loud, like whoever was in there would hear me. I reached for the door handle, but something stopped me. The sound of the breathing, slow, uneven, was right on the other side. It took everything in me to stay calm. I had to think. I couldn't confront whatever was in there. I turned and ran for the wheelhouse, locking the door behind me. My pulse was hammering in my ears, but I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I knew someone was in there, watching me. I glanced back at the cabin through the small window in the wheelhouse door. The curtains shifted, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of a face. A face with sunken eyes and a scraggly beard, staring through the gap. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. My mind couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Who was this person? And how did they get on my boat? I didn't know what to do. I just knew I had to get out of there. I picked up the radio and called the Coast Guard, but my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly speak. As I waited, I kept my eyes locked on that window, praying that whatever was on my boat would just disappear. By the time I reached the nearest port, my hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. The harbor was empty, dark, and silent. But the moment I docked, I saw the flashing lights of the police. I jumped off the boat, hardly able to move my legs. The officers didn't waste any time. They boarded the Tern, rifles in hand, and quickly made their way to the cabin. It didn't take long for them to find him. A man, drenched, hair wild and matted with salt water. His clothes were in tatters, as if he'd been living on the run. His eyes were wide and crazed, a strange grin plastered on his face. He didn't speak, but as they dragged him past me in handcuffs, I caught a glimpse of his face. That same grin, the same look in his eyes. It made my blood run cold. The police questioned him, but he never answered. They had no idea how he had boarded my boat, or why he was there. But as I stood there, watching them take him away, a sickening thought hit me. When I'd heard the breathing, he must have been hiding under the bed. The idea of it made me shiver. He had been so close that I hadn't even known. It was like something out of a nightmare. A man hiding in my cabin, breathing as if he was part of the boat, waiting for the right moment to show himself. I didn't sleep well that night. Hell, I didn't sleep well for weeks. But I eventually made it to my new place by the beach. It's been months now, and I still have trouble shaking the memory of those eyes staring through the curtains. It was a late summer evening when I decided to head out to the coast by myself, to one of those quiet, remote spots I knew well. I didn't want anyone with me. The solitude was part of the appeal. It wasn't a popular spot, barely a few locals knew of it. Perfect for a quiet night of fishing. I packed my gear, loaded up the truck, and drove down a narrow, winding road that led to the beach. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, casting faint reflections across the water. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. It was the perfect night to fish, the kind that felt like it would hold some kind of promise, like you were going to catch something more than just fish. I unloaded the boat, checked the engine, and pushed off from the shore, the hull of the small boat cutting through the calm water with a soft swish. The lights of the distant city were dimming as I ventured farther out. It was peaceful out there, just the hum of the engine and the occasional call of a seagull. I remember I didn't even notice it at first. The silence, the darkness, it all blended together so perfectly. But after a while, I felt something. It wasn't a noise, not really, but a presence. You know that feeling? Like someone staring at you, watching from the shadows? I told myself it was nothing, probably just a figment of my imagination, or the result of too many nights spent alone in the wild. I cast my line out, the lure splashing in the water, and waited. The sound of the waves was still the only thing that broke the silence, but that sense of being watched didn't fade. It lingered, like a creeping unease that crawled under my skin. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see another boat nearby, but the water was empty. Nothing but the occasional ripple. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was then that I saw something, a shadow moving at the edge of my vision, something just beyond the reach of my headlights. My heart skipped, but when I looked again, it was gone. I convinced myself I was just spooked. You're out here alone on a dark ocean, your mind starts to play tricks on you. But it was hard to ignore the sense of unease that had taken hold of me. Something wasn't right. Then I heard it. A splash. A low, subtle sound, too rhythmic to be an animal. I froze, listening. The sound was faint, but it was consistent. It didn't belong to the ocean, it didn't fit the natural rhythm of the sea. And that's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the moonlight, a shadowy figure out on the water. But as I blinked, the figure became clearer. It was a man, standing in the water, just beyond the reach of the boat's light. His clothes were ragged, wet, clinging to his thin frame. He wasn't moving like anyone I'd ever seen, too stiff, too deliberate, like he was waiting for something. My first instinct was to turn on the engine, to get out of there, but something stopped me. Curiosity? Stupidity? Maybe both. I called out, asking if he needed help. No response. I raised my voice, asking again, and then, just as I was about to start the engine, he took a step forward, into the light. That's when I saw his face. It was pale, far too pale. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to glow in the dim light. There was a hunger to his gaze, a wildness, as though he hadn't seen another person in years. His mouth opened, but it wasn't to speak. No, it was to smile. A twisted, grotesque smile that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced. Should I shout for help? Should I run? But before I could make up my mind, he was already moving toward me. He didn't walk, not exactly. It was more like he glided, his feet barely touching the water. I gunned the engine and tried to turn the boat, but my hands were shaking too much to steady the wheel. Then, the boat jerked violently, as though something had grabbed hold of it, pulling me back toward the man. I screamed, yanking the throttle, but the boat didn't budge. "Help!" I shouted, but it felt pointless. The man was too close now, too close for comfort. He was almost at the edge of the boat. His fingers, those long, pale fingers, reached out, brushing against the hull. And then the most chilling thing happened. He spoke. His voice was a rasp, like something dragged across gravel, deep and guttural. "You should have stayed on the shore," he whispered. Something cold and heavy settled in my chest, like I had just stepped into the grave. I could feel my heart racing, my breath quickening, but my body felt numb. I couldn't pull away. I couldn't move. The man, if he could still be called that, stepped closer, his face now inches from mine. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, I could have sworn I saw something beyond madness in them, something ancient and knowing. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he pulled back. His hands clenched into fists, and he let out a sound like a growl. I turned the throttle again, desperation flooding my veins, and this time, the engine roared to life. But he didn't let go. He followed. I don't know how long I fought with the boat, but I knew I had to get away from him, away from whatever it was that was hunting me. The engine sputtered and bucked, but I managed to steer it toward the shore. My hands were slick with sweat, and the fear I felt was all-consuming. He was still behind me, still out there, somewhere. Just as the boat scraped against the sand, I didn't look back. I didn't care. I jumped out, my legs shaking as I ran. The sound of the water lapping against the shore was drowned out by the pounding of my heart in my ears. I never went back to that spot on the water again. And I've never spoken to anyone about what happened that night. But I'm telling you this now because someone, is still out there.